Good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to have your company with us this evening. We have a star-studded cast. We have 6 panelists, and I'm going to introduce them. And I'm going to split them into 2 groups so that we can have a little time in between, halfway through, to think. But first of all, I need to contextualize this. This is part of work that I'm doing with young academics, and so I need to thank Hassan Pandor, Rana Osman, Sanjana Dean. Who else? Have I forgotten somebody? This is part of my team. We're working with Westminster to try and speak truth to power in the corridors of power. And we hope that Naz Shah will be joining us. Last week, John McDonnell was with us. We have also, this is called ICOP, and you can look us up. And we've now also set up an all-party parliamentary group, which allows us to work inside Parliament to run events. I think it's very important that we hold any government to account, whatever one's views are of the current government. It is necessary that we exercise our rights, our democratic rights as citizens. So this event is part of that, but it is also, most importantly, the last day of Islamophobia Month, really important marker. And I would like to dedicate this session to my dear friend and mentor, Professor Dr. Ataullah Siddiqui, whom I first met in the 90s probably, and then, or in the 2000s, Yahya tells me, at Markfield College. He was an amazing example to us all, and we miss him. We all miss him very much. So I think I would like now to introduce all 6 in one go, and then take the first 3. So Zahra Mohammed was elected as the youngest and first female Secretary General of the Muslim Council of Britain in January 2021. Before this, Zahra was active as a Scottish Muslim faith leader. I'm half Scottish, and I can hear a little tiny Scottish accent. Every now and then the vowels are slightly different. And she was also the first Muslim woman to lead the Federation of Student Islamic Societies, which is a really, really important organization. Naz Shah, possibly not here yet, Labour MP for Bradford West, a position which she has held continuously since May 2015. Naz is also the vice chair of the all-party parliamentary group, the APPG for British Muslims, that seeks to highlight to parliamentarians the aspirations of British Muslims, as well as to investigate the forms of discrimination that they face in the UK. Third panelist, Samir Jarraj, is an author and journalist working at the New Statesman and Hyphen Online, a website covering stories for and about Muslims in Europe. He's also contributed to The Guardian, The Humanist, the BBC and Channel 4 News. Samir is also involved in work tackling racial inequalities in health, and he's on the board of Generation Rent, the campaign to improve rights for renters. Rukia Osman, who's a friend and colleague of mine from SOAS, is the Black Student Support Coordinator at SOAS. When she was at the University of Bath Students' Union, Rukia was the first Black education officer. Her contributions to improving higher education were recently recognized because she was included in the top 150 Future Leaders magazine. Yahya Burt is research director at the Iron Institute, an independent think tank examining the issues faced by Muslims and attempting to seek resolutions. Yahya is also a community historian of British Muslim life and has authored a new report called Ummah at the Margins, the Past, Present and Future of Muslim Minorities. Last but by no means least on our panel this evening, Rachel Miner is the founder and executive director of Bellwether International, an NGO working with pre- and post-genocide communities who have experienced severe violations of freedom of religion or belief. Rachel realized the importance of highlighting the issues facing religious minority groups after she worked with the Yazidis in Iraq in 2018. So there's a lot there simply from those very brief biographies to think about. And this evening is really important, not only because of Islamophobia Month, but also because the world and this country are facing some enormous challenges at the moment. So I treasure every moment with such experts. And I would like, please, first to ask Zara to speak to us for 5-8 minutes or so. Zara.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. And thank you, Alison, for such a wonderful introduction. I hope the vowels and the sounds of my accent do trigger some good memories and good thoughts. And this is absolutely such a pertinent conversation for us to have, particularly as the 30th of November marks the end of Islamophobia Awareness Month, but not the end of the work as such. And, you know, just in some of this, for this whole month, I've been talking to lots of civil society groups, corporates, you name it. I've been up and down the country. It's been Interfaith Week as well. And there's been a lot going on in November. But one of the things we've been really reflecting on is not just where we are, but how far we still have to go. And it's been 20 years since Runnymede coined this term Islamophobia. And one of the things to share with you all is that, you know, I've been asked in the course of this month, well, does Islamophobia really exist? Is it real? I'm still getting at, is it real? You know, despite the government's own statistics citing that 40% of religiously motivated hate crime is targeting Muslim communities, you know, and looking at the impact of Islamophobia, not just in terms of physical and verbal abuse, but institutional discrimination, the government's lack of an adoption of a definition, and how it permeates throughout society, not just here locally and nationally, but also internationally, Uyghur concentration camps in China. But I think what I kind of wanted to get across today is, where is the conversation today and how are we moving things forward? And so whilst I've been speaking to audiences across the country and across sectors, you know, I've had questions like, well, does it really exist? How does it manifest? You know, have things changed? But we see lots of Muslims in civil society now. And so surely that's a good thing, you know. Of the census just dropped yesterday and we found that our numbers have increased. And we're awaiting those headlines that are saying that, you know, yeah, we're taking over. And so in this conversation about Islam and Muslims in our context today, I think what we're really finding at the heart of the issue of Islamophobia is that whilst we have grown in numbers, we have grown in diversity, we've also grown in numbers relating to hate crime. So whilst more people do know us, people still don't really understand us. And the political conversations and the media narratives haven't really changed so much. And so when I was elected last year as the first female, we broke the news with that story. What was really interesting was how segments of the media wanted to report that. And even throughout the course of my journey, how it's still been a struggle that what may be perceived as progressive and a change, or there's a woman at the helm, still though, she's part of that organization and they're, you know, they still have these views and they're not really part of the mainstream. And, you know, I've been featured on the front of the Daily Mail and lots of accolades to my name. And so I guess the context that we find ourselves is really troubling, because whilst I myself am third generation, the difficulty for attaining employment still exists. Muslim women are the most marginalized when it comes to employment. You know, the difficulty of achieving progression in your career. So economic empowerment, political capital, cultural capital, social capital, where are we on all of these areas? And, you know, and since I've been on board, you know, I've been touring the country. I was very delighted to literally visit Yahya at his house in the heartlands of Bradford and Birmingham and Swansea and Newport and Cardiff. So I've really gone around the country where there's big diasporas of Muslims and where there's pockets. And one of the growing trends is that Muslims all over the country are still very much worried about Islamophobia. And that's not necessarily about Islamophobia on the street, and that very physical and verbal and abusive type, which we are seeing and not always reporting, but the Islamophobia that we see perpetuated by political leadership, the Islamophobia that makes us worried about the opportunities for young people. You know, 50% of our communities are under the age of 25. It's a very young population, as well as a very old population. So we ask these young people, how confident are you about the future? And they're full of zeal and confidence. Yes, absolutely. But what I've seen visiting educational institutions is that whilst you can get a really great degree, you can get that support from the institution, soon as you step out into that world, well, who is supporting you then? Where is the fairness, the equity? Where is the access and the opportunity? And that's where you start to see the political and divisive ideologues. That's where you start to see the discrimination. And the hardest part about talking about Islamophobia and what underpins it is its systemic nature. It's this institutional part of the problem. It's Nuskani talking about her Muslimness for, being sacked in government. It's Azim Rafiq's story about how he was treated in cricket. It's sporting heroes and celebs. It's everyday people. You just feel like you just know it, but what do you do about it? I've attended sessions where journalists have said, I had to wait 2 hours to open my fast because I was too scared to talk to my employer about, fasting and Ramadan. Other colleagues have shared how, there were lawyers saying, they were told that, from their managers, don't think you're going to get any special treatment just because you're fasting. Don't think it's, and other conversations where I've spoken to public bodies who've said, oh, well, that, yeah, we've got Muslims here and they're just, they're just like us. They're just normal. They just fit in like everybody else, Well, okay. What does that mean? What does it mean to be normal? We just need to fit in. So I think part of our challenge really is, how do we change the story on Islam and Muslims in Britain? And how do we really tackle the deeper rooted and entrenched problem of Islamophobia that doesn't just permeate with physical and verbal abuse, but with our ability to change the opportunities afforded to us? And whilst Muslims have increased in number, as has their misrepresentation in society. So the idea is that there's loads of us and we're everywhere, we're taking over. It's not true. And so the question really is, what are we doing about our misrepresentation? And my final point is that, Islamophobia is kind of flogged as this Muslim issue. We've got to be the kind of flag bearers for it. Okay, in part. But just like racism and just like the idea that, society has to agree it's a problem for it to be tackled. It is a societal evil that it causes, division. And until all of society comes on board, and that's precisely why Islamophobia Awareness Month is so important. It's not just about learning, but it's about getting people forward and saying, here's a commitment to action. We don't need nice bystanders. We need conscious participants. We need people to be awake to these issues and willing to say, well, actually, that's completely out of line. Have you met a Muslim? Do you know what's going on? Do you understand the conversation? And really push things along. But I'll stop there because there's a lot of really great people to speak. The MCBs can really proud and active in the space. We had a parliamentary drop-in session just last week, and we hosted parliamentarians across party to endorse their support to tackle Islamophobia, tackle denial, and endorse a definition. And we're really grateful for all the partners here and for this conversation tonight. And we look forward to any questions ahead. And thank you so much, Alison, for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you. Thank you, Zara. Those points are really hitting the nail on the head. I mean, it's certainly one answer to your question for more fairness is, of course, government policies. We know that Prevent is inherently discriminatory, and we're working very hard on things like the Prevent Watch to reduce that. And that will never stop until there's a change of heart right at the very top. Do we have Naz Shah here this evening at the moment, or shall we go to, I can't see Naz. Are you there, Naz? No. Perhaps you've been called to vote. Samir, are you ready? Are you able to take on the challenge instead of waiting for a few minutes?
Yes, I can kind of share some half-formed thoughts, I'm sure. I just wanted to reflect quickly on something Zara said earlier, which is about the societal responsibility for tackling Islamophobia. One of the things which I think is a key thing to emphasize is that like bigotries don't tend to stay kind of like bounded. That the era that we see of rising Islamophobia is also an era of intolerances towards Jewish people, towards people of color, towards LGBTQ people. That actually kind of like one of the factors that is driving Islamophobia is this kind of like whole range of far right like nationalisms, xenophobias, and bigotries that that are really kind of quite pervasive across not just Europe, the US as well. So I think this is actually something where it's going to be kind of quite a powerful kind of like message of kind of like common cause against the the perpetrators of Islamophobia, whether in government or in civil society, and and ideologically as well, the ideological underpinnings of Islamophobia. And one of the things that I also wanted to kind of like talk a bit about, as a journalist, is obviously the state of the media, and Sanjana and I had this conversation yesterday when she called me up to ask to participate, and it's one of my reflections that yes, the media needs to be more representative. It's horrifically unrepresentative of Muslims in terms of like staffing, in terms of seniority. It's horrifically unrepresentative of people of color, in particular, like African Caribbean, Black African people. It is also the case, in my opinion, that white British journalists should be better at reporting stories about Muslims. They should be able to actually like deploy journalistic skills, journalistic values around like interrogating interrogating topics, interrogating evidence, interrogating sources, and finding out the real kind of crux of stories, and being aware of the narratives that frame that all. It's really like depressing how kind of like poor the kind of quality of like engagement and of like interrogation of facts, evidence, sources, information, whether that's coming from official sources or people within civil society or self-appointed spokespeople or self-appointed experts or any of these things. It is actually kind of like the original assertion of true journalistic values to actually go out, do the work, think about your assumptions, critically examine what is going on, and produce a story with that in mind. But sadly, we are nowhere near that at the moment. I think I'll wrap it up there if I'm not kind of like dropping out too early.
Yeah, these journalistic issues, you're absolutely right. Sorry, I've got a Strepsil to keep me going. Yes, these issues about journalistic skills, it's fascinating. And I think as Zara mentioned, the misinformation, which is not investigated and challenged appropriately, is extraordinary. I mean, going back to Prevent for a minute, my big research project from 2015 to 18, which was the heyday, the absolute peak of the Prevent issues. 1 in 10 students on campus believe that Prevent is a good idea, even though they don't quite know what it is. So, I mean, that's typical of they're not being given information by the outside world, from journalists, for example, of what Prevent is and what it does. And those same students, that 1 in 10, also believe that Islam is not a good thing. So it's almost as if the government policy kind of endorses their latent prejudices. And 1 in 10 of the students on campus are also Muslim. So it's an unpleasant sort of thought that there's a one-on-one relationship there. But I absolutely agree with you, Samir. There should be more activity on the part of journalists, and it's difficult to know how to give them more confidence, because there are Muslim journalists, and we need to give them strength, perhaps get them more involved in working with Parliament, working with government, looking at. I can talk about this later if we have time. The bills which are being put through the at the moment by the government contain the most outrageous and shocking, egregious injustices against our rights and our entitlements, all of us, but will be particularly hard-hitting for minority groups, including Muslims. Now, shall we? I've got a big question for Rukia. Rukia, would you like to talk now, or would you like me? Shall I do if there are any questions for Zara and Samir, and hold back because we haven't got Naz here at the moment. What do you think, Rukia? Would you like to talk now?
I'm happy to talk now if that would be useful. Okay.
Yes, please, that'd be lovely.
Okay, so I'm going to speak mainly from my experience as a Black Muslim and kind of navigating higher education. Actually, I first kind of came through my activism through joining my Islamic society back in 2015, where I found that there wasn't, that much representation of women, first of all, but then also of Black Muslims. So I'm hoping to kind of talk a little bit to you today about the Black Muslim experience and maybe some of the challenges that have come up around that, and maybe focus more on the HE context. So I want to kind of pick up on something that Zara mentioned about the definition of Islamophobia, because I know currently within HE, not every single university has adopted a definition of Islamophobia. And I think this is quite concerning, because without kind of recognizing Islamophobia, what does this mean for, policies that are in place to protect students against Islamophobia? What does this mean for the support that is in place for these students? And, what are the statistics saying in terms of Islamophobic incidences reported on university campuses? And, I think this paints quite a concerning picture. I found that a lot of the, not just within universities, but within communities as well, like a lot of Black representation is missing in the majority of Muslim spaces. And it's not that Black Muslims don't exist in society. We've existed in Britain since the 1900s, have a long history here. But I think it's, of course, the definition of, it's not a definition. I think Muslims have been racialized in a sense. I think Black Muslims have often been excluded from that narrative. And I know a lot of Black Muslims, including myself, have often felt that maybe we don't, belong in Muslim spaces. Maybe we don't necessarily feel like we belong in our Islamic societies. And I think this is quite a, scary and problematic reality for, a lot of Muslim students, Black Muslim students in particular. When I reflect on particularly 2020, which was a challenging year for everyone, especially BME communities and, Black communities with the murder of George Floyd, and share with you maybe an example specifically around some of the conflicting feelings that, Black Muslims might have in relation to their identity. Of course, in response to the murder of George Floyd, there's a rush of people, speaking up, sharing their own experiences about the discrimination that they face. But I found that myself, and not only myself, but my peers were sometimes being questioned around, why were we speaking up about, for Black lives? Why weren't we speaking up for Palestinian lives? Why weren't we speaking up for Muslim lives? And I thought this was quite, I found this quite problematic, because is it not possible to advocate for both of these things? Do you have to choose one or the other? Can both of our identities not exist in peace? And I think, this is a conflict that maybe other, Black Muslims have experienced here. Like, I'm not speaking on behalf of everyone, but I think this is something that I've picked up on a lot from conversations I've had with my communities, where, people often feel like they are forced to kind of choose between both, or have their faith questioned as a result of, their race, whether they're even considered Muslim enough because of the color of their skin, or, feeling like inferior in Muslim spaces. And I think, whilst we're talking about Islamophobia Awareness Month, in this particular space, I also want to highlight that we need to be talking as a community about some of the anti-Blackness that exists in a lot of Muslim spaces. I know that there was a really interesting report, I think it was called Race and Faith in Contemporary Britain, that MCB published recently, which I think is really interesting, an amazing start to kind of highlight Muslim voices. And yeah, there's a lot I could probably say, but I'll kind of pause there unless there's anything you want me to expand on, Alison.
Yeah, no, we want to hear more, I think. I mean, yeah, you're absolutely right that people tend to think there's one feature that characterizes a person. So it could be skin color or the clothes they wear. And you're right that having a complex identity, which we all do, it doesn't seem to cut the ice with people. So what do you think the way forward is?
I think the way forward, there's probably two different things I would share here. Part of it is really recognizing the impact that, you know, people's intersecting identities have on their experience. And I think it will probably take for, you know, the community to kind of really reflect on some of the, you know, biases we have, or maybe some of the anti-Blackness that does exist within some Muslim communities. I think also there's a data element to it, because even, you know, whilst reading reports, some of the reports that I've read, you know, on the Muslim experience often exclude Black Muslims from that narrative. So, and if we're not collecting the data, how are we supposed to understand, you know, the experiences that people are having on the ground? I can give an example on maybe some of the projects that I've been working on around the ethnicity awarding gap. And for context, the ethnicity awarding gap, you know, exists across HE. It's not unique to this sector, but essentially describes that individuals from BAME backgrounds are less likely to do well compared to their white counterparts. So the gap for BAME students is 8.8, but the gap between Black and white students is actually 18.4%, which is quite significant. And, you know, whilst there has been some conversation around what can be done across the sector, I think we need to be moving a lot more quickly on it. But the reason why I'm bringing this up is because I found that often, you know, when it comes to these kinds of projects, we look at Black students as a whole. We don't recognize the intersecting identities within that. I've noticed on the ground working with students every day that Black Muslim students have a very unique experience, and they have a lot of challenges that they're experiencing in relation to maybe the culture of their background. But if we don't collect, you know, faith data and analyze faith data, you know, and how it intersects with race data, the statistics, we can't tell the story from statistics. And because HE is such a data-driven sector, it makes it difficult to act if we don't have the data to back it up. So that's kind of why I'm pushing this data element, because it's almost like we're invisible in spaces and also invisible within the data as well, which makes it difficult to try and navigate the challenge.
Yeah, completely right. And of course, the intersectionality of being female, Black and Muslim together can, as you say, bring extraordinary difficulties. Zara, may I ask you if you'd like to comment on Rukia's brilliant presentation, some of the issues she raises?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, that's why we had the Proudly Muslim and Black project and produced a report and a series of essays from over 40 contributors to discuss this issue, because I think, you know, part of our challenge is not just what's outside in that space, but also how we can improve the situation inside. And it's not just Black, there's convert communities, disabled communities, minorities within minorities, and we are so much more diverse than we've ever been. And I think that's probably what goes back to the issue of Islamophobia, is because we're homogenized as one kind of block. We're all the same. We all look the same. We all dress the same, and we all practice the same, and everybody is the same. But actually, we embody so much diversity even within ourselves. And young people today will espouse that even more than the elder generation, whether they're cultural affiliations or just having their own platform and their own voice on social media. So I think part of that is understanding that these old narratives have not really caught up with who we are today and who we are becoming as communities. And I think people need to, and I think that's the problem with Islamophobia, is that we're just all the same. And therefore, if you look or are perceived to be Muslim, then yeah, we're going to go for you.
Yes, thank you very much. I wondered if that I could just ask Zara, and maybe Samia, you might like to comment on it after Zara's spoken, about issues in the media. I mean, you might not want to remember this, but I remember your Woman's Hour interview very early on, and I wondered if you wanted to comment about what we could do in the future to avoid that kind of impasse. And then maybe Samia, from your expert journalistic view, you might like to comment. Zara.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, for those who haven't seen it or aren't aware of it, it was day 4 of my election. So I'd just been elected. I was averaging around 9 interviews a day. We broke the news, I think. And people were really, generally speaking, people were really positive and very excited and very curious. What's going on? Who's this new Secretary General? What is she about? What's the Scottish accent? What's going on? And the premise of the interview, I mean, look, when you're the Secretary General of the MCB, you know you're going to get tough interviews. So I don't think we're here to say, oh, don't give us tough interviews. I think what we're saying is the premise of that interview was it was supposed to be positive, intimate, we want to get to know more about you. So the framing was, it was going to be about a great achievement, more about you. And it's Women's Hour. So obviously you're adding it together and you're thinking, okay, should be a really nice and soft piece. And then the story before mine, because we were in a Zoom room quite like this one, so I could see everybody. And it was about, a lady who was jogging and the experiences and how difficult it was. And the presenter was very, very empathetic. So I thought, okay, we must be fine. And then obviously, as soon as I came on, the tonality completely changed. There was a build up and every question was laced with stereotypes. It became a hostile interview that sparked a bigger conversation around Muslim women in leadership and how we're treated. And, I was on the front page of The Guardian. There was an open letter with Saida Warsi, Diane Abbott, and a whole bunch of politicians, academics, authors, and notable personalities had signed it. And I think it was a real moment to reflect that, this was a really good, positive story, yet certain parts of the media felt it was appropriate to have this kind of an interview, this kind of an intervention. And I think we're all kind of left it. And a lot of people to this day ask me about it, and people just wonder, well, what was the point? But as soon as that interview was had, then there was a headline in a certain newspaper publication, and it went on and on. So I think my learning from that is that, it was a big baptism of fire for me. You can't ever be complacent with these things, but also that I just felt really disappointed that, in 2021 at that time, huge election, huge historic win, the conversation hadn't really gone anywhere. And we were still being trivialized and stereotyped and, these tropes. And so it was kind of like, oh, okay, really great achievement, but not really. And I think in terms of, I guess, I don't know if you can ever avoid it or mitigate it, but I think it's about challenging, which is what exactly happened. People were outraged, not just Muslims, people listening, ordinary people were outraged, thinking, what on earth is this? I know colleagues, people within the BBC were outraged, telling me that we were outraged, and we made a complaint. So a lot of people complained about it. I think it harks back to the kind of society we want. Yes, of course, tough interviews are going to be there. Don't do us any favors. That's fine. But, what was this necessarily achieving in the pursuit of media and information and education? What exactly was it? And I think it was hostile and just alluded to the way that Muslims are treated. So I don't know if it can necessarily be avoided, but certainly I think it should be challenged. It should be called out. And the kind of work that the Centre for Media Monitoring does, which is a project of the MCB, is absolutely to analyse it. And, they analysed over 60,000 pieces of media and print, press, radio, and found that 60% of all coverage was negatively biased towards Muslims. So yeah, I guess it's a little, what do they call them? A war scar for me and something that I'm known for, unfortunately, on my wiki page. But she did me a huge favor too, because she just highlighted part of the problem and I guess what we need to do in terms of tackling it, just call it out.
Yes, thank you very much. It was as you said, it did bring out outrage though in your support, which was you shouldn't have been put through it, but it was a good outcome in some respects. Samir, I was just wondering about the way in which maybe you might agree that Muslims are often seen as that they're pigeonholed. You know, interview a Muslim about something that you think Muslims only know about, and whether that can be really counterproductive. I don't know. I mean, the shared humanity that we should be celebrating then is put in the wastepaper basket, and this is the difference is then made to be abnormal. I don't know if you have any experience of that yourself or want to comment on it.
I mean, so, you know, I think it is part of the kind of the flattening down, like, you know, the diversity within the community is in fact like really like narrowing down the story. I think kind of one of the imperatives that drives the media towards like, you know, kind of like incredibly hostile, confrontational interviews like that is, you know, the pressure within the media organizations to stand out and to, like, you know, the phrase is often kind of like move the story on, that we've had the story about something, we need to press it further, and that kind of often reveals the kind of like the utter lack of insight and knowledge that is actually kind of like brought to, or how do you develop the story? Like it, like first Muslim leader of the NCP, of the MCP, you can do that story, and then just like, well, how do we progress the story? And then just kind of falling back to this kind of quite lazy kind of, you know, kind of like line of questioning, whereas, you know, you can give you a really like tough and difficult interview about really like important and material like issues. That doesn't mean that, you know, that it doesn't have to like really kind of like ask difficult questions, challenge your authority, challenge the organization, but it's like coming to it from a place of knowledge, as opposed to coming from a place of like, well, I have these kind of ideas, these kind of like these stories circulating inside, I'm going to apply them to my kind of subject, this, like my interviewee this week. And it's just, you know, like it's just deeply disappointing, because there are so many issues that deserve attention, you know, within Muslim communities in the UK, within Europe, within the world, and just kind of the same old kind of like damaging, but also like very boring like narratives that are trotted out, really kind of do a disservice to you know, the media consumer, to and to the, you know, the journalists themselves. Like it's something like, again, like your average journalist should be better at thinking about, knowing about where to and how to develop a story. It shouldn't just be, I'm going to fall back on, you know, on some like view that it just like Islamophobic views that kind of pervade society, and just kind of like throw that at you as a question.
Yeah, it's a challenge facing you professionally and emotionally and personally. You've made that very clear. Thank you very much. We've got 2 questions here, and I thought I might sorry, I might ask Zara to have a go at the first one from Mohammed, and then Rukia to have a go at the second one from Avery. So the first one from Mohammed is for Zara. I'm asking Zara to answer it. Last week, I attended the launch of the Islamophobia Index by the Equality Review Act of Parliament. Most people, particularly from my demography, are not on the digital revolution, and we're often not able to travel. So beyond the Zooms and the parliamentary meeting rooms, how could we reach a wider audience? So that's a question for Zara. And then after that, for Rukia, please, from Avery. What are your thoughts on people who separate Muslim people from Islam, the ideology? There are some critics of Islam, the ideology, who maintain a love and respect for Muslims as people. So I'm going to ask Zara to consider this one about how to get the word out. And it also speaks to what Samir was saying about restricted narratives and restricted tropes within journalism.
Yeah, I think, you know, the challenge that we have is sometimes it's not actually about doing events and you know, sometimes it's just about meaningful relationships. You know, the easiest place to start sometimes is very much locally. If I've understood the question right, it's about how do you get the message across, how do you build partnership. Yeah. So I think what's really important is everyday relationships are so critical to transforming the conversation, because you can start nationally and you know, you've got all those different avenues and they're influencers, but when people meet you and they know you, it's very difficult to be Islamophobic unless you're, you know, you've made a really bad impression and whatever else it is going on. But genuinely, you know, some of the, I've traveled across most mosques in this country now have a food bank. And I recall a mosque in Newham, and the ladies, they deliver the food parcels every week to the elderly. And, you know, they say that sometimes it's the first conversation that they've had all day is speaking to us when we deliver their food packages. And I'm not saying that, you know, it's down to just be a good person and people will like you and therefore they'll like Islam. But what I'm saying is that, you know, whatever you are and whatever your sphere of influence, that alone is enough. You know, if you're not digitally savvy and you can't physically attend events, then what about the people around you? What about neighbors and friends? What about building those allies who do have a platform, who do have exposure, or simply are part of a conversation? Because, you know, a friend of mine was talking about her mother-in-law. So mother-in-law is not Muslim. And she was telling, you know, she was saying how outraged she was because she was in a conversation with her friends who were being very racist and very Islamophobic, not knowing that her, you know, daughter-in-law was a Muslim. And so she became this advocate, very strong advocate for Muslims in a very kind of unbeknown way. And in some ways, they were quite shocked because she said, I told them straight, like, what exactly are you talking about? She said, I've known these people for years and I could not believe what they were saying and the generalizations they were making. And so I don't think anybody should ever feel deterred or despondent or just like, oh, I can't do it because I don't have access or I don't have a platform. But every one of us has a role to play, because challenging misinformation and fake news or the stereotyping or propaganda, whatever, it just requires active participation. It requires a conscious effort to call things out. And honestly, relationships are so key to that. So I've literally sat and spoke to people who don't agree. They're not, you know, they may not be Islamophobic, but they may not even understand the issue. They might even be interested to understand the issue because they've got other things going on in their life. What's it to them? You know, but they've met me. I could be the first Muslim woman they've ever met, the first conversation they've ever had. You know, just today I was speaking to Camden Council, the borough of Camden, and over 200 employees were on that call, all different walks of life. And for some of them, this may be the first ever conversation they've had to do with Islamophobia, you know. And so I think we all have that opportunity. And I don't think we need to shoulder all of the responsibility. I think we just do the little bit that we can do. And that really is enough.
Thank you very much. That's very heartening. Rukia, would you like to have a go at Avery's question, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's an interesting question, and and you know, that question combined with what Samir and Zara were saying makes me think of just the criticism that, you know, Muslims as individuals get based on, you know, their faith. For instance, if we look at the NUS and what happened with, you know, the president, who was a Black Muslim woman, and how, you know, she received a lot of hatred and you know, criticism from the media, not because of her as an individual, but maybe because of, you know, there's a lot of Islamophobic kind of commentary and a lot of Islamophobic comments she received. So it kind of turned into people who may not agree with Islam attacking her as an individual, as a human being. And I think we've kind of, you know, that becomes dangerous territory. And I kind of see this happening a lot where, you know, Muslims as individuals are painted to be, you know, the representative of all Muslims. And as one person, there's no way you're going to represent everybody. And I think, you know, that's a dangerous, you know, situation to be putting individuals in, and then to hold them accountable for, you know, the millions and billions of Muslims out there. I think that becomes quite dangerous. And I think it's better to be looking at people as individuals. I'm not sure, you know, necessarily where I understand Avery's question, and I think it's really critical and vital to maintain respect for individual human beings, because that's what we are at the end of the day, regardless of our faith and our political beliefs. And if you do have a problem with a certain faith or a certain political belief, it's everyone can have their criticisms. We don't all have to agree with each other, but at the end of the day, we have to respect each other regardless of our differences. I think that's kind of how I would approach that question. If anyone else wants to kind of chip in, let me know. But I think I want to make sure, it's best to separate. It's good to separate those two things. You might not necessarily agree with what someone believes, but don't let that affect the way you treat them. And that's where Islamophobia comes from, because Muslims aren't treated as individuals by some people, and they experience abuse because of maybe sometimes misconceptions individuals have of Islam, or some disagreements they have with the faith.
Thank you very much, Rukia. I think you've nailed it. That was a brilliant answer. Yahya, you left briefly. I'm glad to see you back again, because I would like to ask you, please, Dr. Burt, if I may, to talk to us.
Good evening. Thank you for inviting me, Alison, and everybody at SOAS. I'm honoured to be part of this distinguished panel. I think I just want to make a few brief kind of reflections on the census. We can't say anything detailed about the new figures on religion in the UK, because none of us have had time to analyse the data that's come out, but perhaps we can think a little bit about the big picture. So that basically there are three trends that come out with regard to religion in the UK. The first is that for the first time a minority are identifying as Christian. Secondly, that there is a huge rise in the number of people who identify with no religion. And of course, what that means could be very complicated, as research shows. It doesn't mean nuns are uniform, but nonetheless, they're not identifying with any established, discrete religious tradition. And the third is that Islam remains Britain's second largest religion, and now has nearly 4 million people who self-identify as Muslim on the national census. So I think that above and beyond that, we've heard now that we have ethnic minority majority cities in Britain. This won't be news to people who follow these issues, but obviously the census is a moment at which this is highlighted. So now we have Birmingham, Luton, and Leicester, which have been highlighted, and BAME groups tend to be more religiously devout, whatever their background, and so we're really facing a very pivotal moment, a change in Britain, where we have sort of pious urban super diversity meets a post-Christian nation. And it seems to me that in the last decade, we have had a moral panic about that. If we take the Trojan horse scandal in Birmingham of 2014, if we stand back from that, really you had local Muslims successfully managing a number of schools in highly deprived areas where the children were achieving extraordinarily high results because their culture and faith background was appreciated and nurtured in the school environment. But what we got was, what we've had in Britain is a pushing out of Muslim professionals out of running these schools on the bogus grounds of entryism, and they've been pushed out, and essentially schools in these cities like Birmingham, Bradford and elsewhere have become more like the French idea of the school. So the school has become a space of cultural assimilation, fundamental British values, which is broad and vague enough to actually allow for a kind of marriage of convenience across the British political spectrum. So people can bring in all sorts of assimilationist ideas into the school and riding roughshod over the identities of children from non-white British backgrounds. So values, whatever fundamental British values are, they will be pushed through and taught in a kind of assimilationist mode in the school. And so the cultural and religious identity of these children is no longer being valued. It's being run roughshod over. And because of the kind of political agreement, wide political agreement across the political spectrum in British politics on this changed role of the school, it has left Muslim communities feeling a sort of quandary about what they can do about it, because they feel a little bit politically friendless on this issue. And because of that, we haven't been able to generate the community leadership on this issue from within the Muslim communities that one would have liked to have seen. There are a number of complex reasons for that I can't go into tonight. That impasse has meant that there's been little forceful pushback from the Muslim community, even though there's a great deal of disquiet about some of the things that have gone on in these schools. I'll mention one. There's been very strong linkages between certain schools in Birmingham and the UK military. And this has really gone unremarked, where there is almost a sort of a very big push in the guise of countering extremism, prevent, to actually kind of it feels like a kind of sort of a semi-militarization of the educational space in one or two cases. And this has really been fully endorsed by the government, in fact, pushed by the government. So it's not something that I think we should, all these sorts of issues around structural Islamophobia are actually coming directly from the state. And this is one of the things that we have, is that, and I would, as I've argued in the recent report that I've written at the margins, this is why I think that because Muslims in Britain are facing a kind of political consensus between Labour and the Conservatives on this, that it's actually important for even our representational bodies like the Muslim Council to lean more back into a countercultural advocacy mode and a little bit less upon the kind of traditional routes of parliamentary lobbying and so on. Because I do believe that actually at the moment we're facing a kind of consensus of the political class. And until that changes, it's going to be very difficult for British Muslims to find allies and to get leverage on issues like this, which really aren't being discussed, precisely because they are so difficult. How much more time do I have, Alison? I can't hear you.
Please carry on.
Oh, all right. So the other thing that I wanted to touch on briefly, because I know that Ruqayya and others have talked about intersectional issues in the Muslim community with vis-a-vis Islamophobia. So let me touch very briefly on another issue where I think that the impact of Islamophobia is refracted into divisions within the Muslim community, and how difficult it is to tackle these issues. How in fact the trauma and hurt is directed back out internally in the Muslim community. And again, this is something that rarely gets discussed. So not get discussed enough in fora like this. So this is the issue of how, if you like, Muslim men who feel emasculated, if you like, by structural Islamophobia, they feel disrespected, allied with some traditional notions of masculinity, they refract that back into a kind of gender war dynamic within the Muslim community. So I would call this throwing Muslim women under the Islamophobia bus. Okay, this is really a friend of mine, Thamina, calls it misogynisa. You know, so hatred of Muslim women. It can be expressed internally in the community, but also externally within towards the Muslim community. And so what we find really is that there's a younger generation of men who are now being attracted by YouTube influencers. My son was warning me about them, and so I had a look and started investigating it. And there's a convergence really between kind of some right-wing YouTube Muslim influencers, the men's movement online, and the alt-right. And I mean, it's quite astonishing to think, because the alt-right obviously has connections to some openly racist attitudes and Islamophobic attitudes, but nonetheless, because of this issue around gender, nonetheless, there is some convergence, I would say, if not conversion. So while I wouldn't want to say that this is a majority trend, it is actually quite widespread. I mean, even some of the local ISOCs in Yorkshire, I've seen this kind of rhetoric coming through into ISOC events and things like that, and speakers get invited and the topics that they talk about. So it's not something to dismiss. But I would again stipulate that it is really, I think, a refraction of a more broadly Islamophobic environment. And I would also say that there is also kind of anxiety over changing norms around gender identity, sexual orientation, and so on. So that hits Muslim communities like a tsunami, for them to be able to metabolize that issue without being described as fundamentalist and extremist and so on. So that brew comes together in a kind of gender war within Muslim community, especially in the younger generation. So this, again, these kind of very complicated dynamics really need to sort of unpick and try and make sense of and try and gain traction on and do something constructive about.
Yeah, that's a really telling analysis, and I recognize that from some of my friends. How do you think it could be handled for future generations? Because obviously our destiny is really tied up with the young generations coming up to adulthood now.
I mean, I don't know if it's for me to say, it's a 50-something. I mean, I think that I'm going to make a couple of very radical suggestions that sound preposterous, because all radical ideas are preposterous when you first mention them. But I do think that we need to advocate for at least a reduction in a kind of monocultural liberal nationalism, which has one idea of diversity. I would rather argue for sort of deep diversity, what John Gray called modus vivendi, live and let live, where you have different peoples in a state, they come together, they cooperate in the good, they live peaceably together, but we don't expect everybody to have exactly the same conception of the good. And this is what makes sense in a super diverse society where we have people coming from all over the world and settling in Britain. You know, if we stick to an assimilationist model in schools, for instance, for children, I see there's going to be a whole string of confrontations with working class parents, because what you're asking them to do is to send their children into a school that's actually saying, actually, we know how to bring up your child better than you do. And that's going to cause conflict. Until there's a consensus in society around what a school can do. So for instance, I think schools should maybe focus on making people do academically well and get them ready and give them life skills, whereas communities can deal with, you know, moral and ethical issues. And I think this is one way to deal with a different kind of pluralism, which is moral and ethical pluralism, if I can say. So in other words, we need a pluriversalism, because if there are different kinds of worldviews around in communities in Britain today, They only live together, except that, okay, somebody else has got a form of universalism. We also have a form of universalism, but they don't exactly see eye to eye, but they overlap enough for us to cooperate in the good and live peaceably together, and that's enough. So I think that, you know, a post-national state would be one that would give up a kind of strong assimilationist project, either moral, ethical, or tied to kind of a national identity that is prescriptive and narrow. It would have to be a radical monetary democracy, as John Keane calls it. It has to be a full democracy at all levels of social and civic institutions, and not just at the top level of politics. So that those would be my prescriptions.
Yes, I think that really strikes a nerve in terms of the fact that the right-wing threads that you've identified, which are misleading for some young Muslim men who feel lost, they are endorsed by many in power today, because the right wing is seen as still again seen as less of a threat to whatever it is that is supposed to be threatening us than Muslims, who are again being, as William Shawcross's legacy to us, that Muslims are again being presented as a threat. And as you say, that hits the Muslim male very hard and makes it difficult, very difficult for him to have a clear run to establish his own adult identity. Thank you very much, Yahya. I hope we have time to come back to that later, because it's so important. Rachel, you've been waiting very patiently, and I hope that you're still with us. Will you speak to us now, please?
Absolutely. There's been so many insights. So I first just want to thank everyone for teaching each other. These safe spaces of learning are so important for combating Islamophobia. So I hope that everyone who's been part of this has had an opportunity to learn. And second, it's quite dangerous to go last, because I'm the only thing keeping everyone from a nice cup of cocoa, a warm bed. So I will try and make my insights poignant and relevant. I want to take 2 steps back so we can take 5 steps forward, and just deconstruct slightly the term Islamophobia. In plain terms, it's fear of Islam. But where does fear come from? It comes from ignorance. We tend to fear what we don't know, what we don't understand, what we haven't learned for ourselves. And what is the consequence of ignorance? Isolation. So kind of bringing full circle a lot of things that have been mentioned, including some of the questions in the chat. In order to combat Islamophobia, we have to confront ignorance and isolation at the same time. And that's achieved through proximity. When you know a Muslim, when you love a Muslim, when you have Muslims in your neighborhood, when you have Muslims that you go to school with, or you share groceries with, or you're on the football pitch with, right? And that's something every single one of us can do as a result of this call today, is take the principle of proximity into our lives. So if you know a Muslim, amazing, meet some more Muslims and learn to advocate for them, and teach them how to advocate for you, so that reciprocity can build democracy in society in meaningful ways. If you don't know a Muslim, you've met a few on this call tonight, and take it upon yourself to learn and engender trust to people who believe differently than you do, who live differently than you do. So with that kind of in mind, I want to make a few comments on the report, which I think there's really not a lot more that I can say, which is novel, but something that struck me about the census report is that we tend to look at these numbers kind of artificially, and then to create hierarchies of belief. Like a Christian minority, what does that mean? A rising percentage of people who have no religion, what does that mean? What I want everyone to kind of suspend, instead of bring in as an assumption, is that there is no race to the top. There's no race to 100% of your belief system. And there's no good or bad that comes from being a majority or minority. What's important is how those belief groups live together, and the peace that they bring, and the conception of the good that they're free to practice. So I've seen some celebrations that Christians are not in the majority. I've seen celebrations that nuns are now a larger portion of the population. I would discourage that kind of artificial celebration. What are we celebrating? Right? As if we're celebrating numbers, I think that can lead to further divides. If we're celebrating people and differences, that's where democracy can thrive. So I just wanted to throw that into the conversation. And then come back to something that Zara mentioned and a few others mentioned, which is this sameness versus difference, right? When we lump all Muslims into the same category, that's when fear can really thrive. But also, I think when we throw Muslims into difference, they're different than us, they don't believe the same or whatever the differences may be. So actually, phobias happen on both sides of the extreme. Phobia happens when we assume that an entire group is the same, and phobia also happens when we assume that an entire group is existentially different. So what we need to focus on, in addition to proximity, is the middle ground, which sounds cliche, but phobia doesn't happen in the middle. Connections happen in the middle, where we can acknowledge where is the sameness and where is the difference. And where does that sameness bring us together? Where does the conception of the good actually overlap? I don't think it's possible for a society to thrive if every single person has a different conception of the good, but it can thrive if we bring our conceptions of the good together and say, oh, I have a family too. Oh, I love the World Cup too. Oh, I live in Birmingham too. And then celebrate difference in a meaningful and organic way. So how do we kind of stratify sameness and difference and bring back the human element, which is a genuine connection with genuine people? And lastly, I just want to say that we can combat the misinformation. We can combat the division in our society, but a lot of it has to do with what happens in our own sphere of influence. If we don't have the courage to confront our own family members, our workplace, our schools, then remember where we started. That isolation leads to fear, leads to phobias. So if we can all make a concerted effort to find the isolation in our own lives, what beliefs am I isolating myself from? What part of Islam or Muslims or the community or misinformation am I actually pulling away from? And confront that isolation and re-engage, rebuild, then we'll see this coming together. I just want to acknowledge that's really hard post-COVID, because when you think about what COVID did to society, particularly for Islamophobia, it is the textbook definition of isolation, right? We isolated in every way possible. And now we're relearning as a society how to re-engage. So we can be cognizant of that. We can be patient and loving and kind with each other. We don't have to tolerate injustice. Those are not the same things. And we don't have to endure persecution. But we can acknowledge society's relearning how to walk in some ways, relearning how to engage with each other. And as allies of Islam and as allies of Muslim friends and family, we can lead the way and model what that re-engagement looks like, especially through these kinds of conversations. And my last point is that this matters in the UK, but it also matters abroad. There is millions of Muslims that are suffering, and Zara also referred to this, the Uyghurs, the Rohingya. And this is a lot of what I confront every single day in my work with Bellwether International. What we forget sometimes is that living in the UK, we live in a position of privilege, and the world is watching us very closely. And the way we treat Muslims here has an effect for Muslims everywhere. We can model domestically and internationally what it looks like to live with difference and sameness. We can model together what it looks like to live in love and understanding, overcome ignorance, most of all, overcome isolation, create proximity, and rebuild communities. And I am hopeful that even with the trends and the census and all of these numbers, we can bring the human element back to the Islamic community, to our Muslim friends and family, and we can tackle Islamophobia. We can see those numbers decrease with time. And most of all, we can see our families and communities thrive in a position of love and inclusivity for all. So maybe maybe I've had to strike the right balance between the negative and the positive, but hopefully everyone feels a little bit more empowered to tackle Islamophobia through these examples. And really thank you again for all the comments. I hope that I've given something to this amazing discussion, and that we can all apply some of these little things that happen every day in our lives to tackle the Islamophobia.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I think I've got a question for you from William Money on Clubhouse. I think you've partially answered it because you covered the issue of phobias, but the question is from William Money on Clubhouse: a phobia is an irrational fear. According to the Quran and the actions of Muhammad, why should non-Muslims not fear Islam? So there's a lot that's unstated in that question.
Quite difficult when we talk about rational versus irrational. Who decides? Who decides when someone is acting rational or not? And typically with Islamophobia, people who are acting aggressively and persecuting those who believe differently think they're acting rationally. So sometimes I find it counterproductive to get too technical or academic about where rationality lies, and instead try and, as I mentioned, bring back the human element. If we understand that humans act out of fear when they don't understand something, when they are ignorant about something, when they don't know someone, when there's no proximity in their life to people who believe differently, it's easier to kind of overcome this divide between Muslim and non-Muslim, and instead just look at human dignity. But of course, there are people who pass a threshold. Let me also just say that. There are people who do not act rationally and never will. And as a society and as a community, that's where we rely on legal mechanisms to protect us. That's where we rely on our communities to protect us, our basic freedoms, freedom of religion or belief to protect us. And we can put those basic protections in place. So I don't know if I've answered the question, but I think in the end, seeing people as people, loving them, giving them a chance to learn, and then guiding them through the process of what it looks like to be a protector of all people of all faiths, then we can overcome a lot of fear, a lot of misinformation. And we do have to re-engage in person. I think technology gives us amazing access to things, but there's nothing that replaces in-person communication, engagement, love, life. And so I'm just a huge proponent of that for overcoming any phobia.
Thank you so much, Rachel. We've got two more questions. One of them is about the World Cup, and it's about media coverage in the World Cup. And Samir, I don't know if you're keen on football, but if you are, would you like to answer this question, which is, what impact do you feel the media coverage of the World Cup has had on Muslim communities here? And just before we go on to that, there is then a question which I think perhaps I would ask every panelist. I know Zara has possibly gone already, she had to leave early, but this is a question from, that was the football one was from Yasmin Harum, MSA, and this last one, which I think is a good way to finish, and everybody, perhaps if everybody can have a little go at this, this is the key, this is the crux of it all, from Munna Ahmad. How do we instill confidence within ourselves and our youth as Muslims, given how debilitating Islamophobia and racism can be? Sometimes it chips away at you without you realizing. So I think that's really one reason why we're here this evening. Samir, are you keen on football? Or because of your expertise in the media, would you like to say a little bit about this coverage?
So I'm not especially keen on football. I can speak a little bit maybe to coverage. I mean, I think it's been quite varied, I would say. Like, I think some of the, I feel kind of like very important coverage around the Qatar, the host country's human rights record. There are very pertinent questions to be asked, as like vast majority of the migrant workers who work in Qatar are Muslims from the South Asian continent. So like, I think, you know, there's very good coverage and questions to be had there. And there was an interesting kind of segment on BBC media show where they were kind of posing this to Gary Lineker, and one of his reflections was how poorly the coverage had been of of sports events in Russia in recent years, and it actually kind of like, yes, let's apply a thorough and consistent standard around interrogating the human rights records of any country hosting a sporting event. I'd be like very happy with that. I think there's a really important kind of like thing to be advanced by doing that, but also like fundamentally a lot of those issues are driven by like very problematic issues within FIFA itself, and within the kind of the structure of international football, but also of international sports more generally. Like, there's a lot to be done there. And in answer to the second question, I mean, I think that there is something to be said for ensuring that you have your support network, supportive like friends, family, community around you in terms of countering that corrosive effect of Islamophobia, doing what you can to counter it, but also like being aware that of things like burnout, and of actually kind of like being able to make time for caring for yourself and people around you, and not trying to defeat this incredibly resilient, wide-ranging, and kind of quite deep structural inequalities.
Thank you very much. Yes, online hyphen. Do you try to produce? Do you show different images of Muslims? Just very briefly. Sorry, I realise we've only got a quarter of an hour.
Oh yes, yeah. So I mean, I'd say like we put out like positive and interesting stories about the Muslim communities, but we also like report on the issues affecting them. So, for example, we did a story recently on Muslim women weightlifters. For Yaha's point earlier, we just published today an article about Muslim men who've been red pilled, which is like one of the terms within the kind of like especially like the radicalization of men. It comes from the Matrix and everything. But again, this kind of like how these kind of like ideas are making inroads amongst kind of young Muslim men, and the effect that it's having on them and the people around them as well, because like as you're saying, like this is often directed against the women in their lives, and women more generally, despite it being kind of quite a fundamentally Islamophobic ideology that has been carried over into it.
Sure. Thank you very much. Rachel, would you like to add anything to Munir's in an answer to Munir's question? I mean, you've already given some very powerful responses before Munir's question was raised about how do we counter the effect of the chipping away of confidence and confidence.
Yeah, I dedicate my life to protecting freedom of religion or belief. And I frequently tell people of all faiths or none that if you don't bring your whole self into the public square, it's very difficult to identify what it is we're protecting. So in terms of the corrosive effect of Islamophobia, practice Islam, practice with people you love, and celebrate what it means to be Muslim and the beautiful parts of culture, and join an interfaith network where people also appreciate that about you, and create spaces in community, in private and in public, to bring your whole self to whatever you're doing, your Islamic self, your Muslim self. And I think that's the most powerful way we can combat any opposition to beliefs, but particularly to faith. We have to practice our faith, and we have to remind ourselves why faith is important, and then surround ourselves with kindness and people who appreciate that part of who we are. The same way we appreciate different identity claims of people in other belief groups. We can create a culture of reciprocity where we are protecting other identity claims, whether it be LGBTQI or non-belief, and then teach reciprocity, help people to celebrate the Muslim part of who you are. And then we can combat that opposition together and create a very diverse and beautiful society where we actually just learn to celebrate difference and different beliefs instead of attack. But we have to model that, especially in our own lives and in our own communities, really through worship and practicing the very best of our faith.
Thank you very much. Rukia, would you be able to give your answer to Munir's question about how we counteract this chipping away at confidence?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to echo something that Summer said about making sure you have support networks and circles around you. And I want to, like, the advice I would give maybe in response to that question is, you know, for people to continue being like unapologetic in who they are and, you know, practicing their faith and not letting the negativity, the racism or the Islamophobia impact them or, you know, affect them from navigating their daily lives or, you know, making them feel isolated from wider society, because the majority of people don't think, you know, the majority of people are not racist or Islamophobic, but it's often, you know, the people who do have the loudest voices. So I would just encourage you, you know, people to just constantly remind themselves of that, because it can be quite difficult, you know, when it's the negative comments that, you know, you're hearing all of the time, and it can feel like, you know, the world is against you, or, you know, there's almost too much Islamophobia or racism to cope with. So I think it's just reminding yourself of like the wider perspective. And also, you know, as individuals, we don't have to, you know, fight against Islamophobia and racism all of the time. It's okay to take breaks. It's okay to pick your piece and, you know, sometimes refuse to engage, you know, with this negativity, because at the end of the day, our, you know, own health and well-being is the most important thing. So sometimes, you know, you don't have to fight everybody. You know, I would say always protect your peace and make sure that you remind yourself of the good that is around you, whether that's in your community or outside the community. And I think, you know, practicing doing that can help kind of reinstill your confidence, you know, back when it comes to dealing with these kinds of incidences.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's very true. There's universal truths there. Yahir, how about your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it's very important. Is sheer confidence, a sense of self-belief, self-esteem, a sense of personal dignity. I mean, all of these things are essential because Islamophobia and racism, if internalized, eat away at that sense of selfhood that everybody should have, that sort of sense of dignity. I guess rather than giving kind of personal advice, I would kind of make a broader point, which is the importance of moral and ethical education within the Islamic tradition. And it seems to me that a lot of those sorts of traditions were crafted in a time when Muslims were in political power and the ascendancy. And so a lot of the kind of the gist of that teaching is combating egotism and arrogance and pride and so on. Whereas when those teachings are applied indiscriminately today, what that does is already knock down somebody who's already underconfident. And so I believe that those sort of the kind of the emphasis of those systems of moral and ethical education have to be reformed so that they actually help build a sense of confidence and self-esteem in our young people. The resources are there within the tradition, but it needs to be properly developed, and a kind of pedagogy against Islamophobia, if you know what I mean, is extremely important. So we have to think structurally about this above and beyond what individuals might do to keep their confidence afloat.
Thank you very much. There's a lot to think about there. And I think in concluding, I would come back to something that Zara said, which is being alive to one's locality, to the local community, to friends and contacts. And Rachel made this point as well. But also, I think in the times we're living in, there is so much change and so much uncertainty that I really think there is a benefit to the work my team and I are doing in Westminster, because, as I mentioned at the beginning, there are many bills being rushed through which will affect all of us. They will affect Muslims, other minority groups, but all of us. Austerity, for example, depends how you do your sums. Is there really a great black hole which has to be filled? Or is this a political decision about where the money is being spent? There are arguments that the austerity concept is actually used repeatedly to take away opportunities from those who don't have many and to benefit those who already have lots of opportunity and lots of money. So these are universal issues, and particularly during this difficult winter that faces us. There's also the issue about how we've left the European Union. We've got about 4,000 bits of legislation which protect all of us, whoever we are. And if they are simply chucked in the bin, which was William Rees-Mogg's idea, then none of us will be properly protected. So working with a young team of academics who are the Muslim faith is well represented within that group, and I'm very pleased about that. That means that we feel we have a certain level of agency, which we didn't have before. Could say that's pointless because this current government has a very large majority, but actually I think everybody has to make an effort. And this comes back to the comments that all of you have made, and most recently Yahya and Rachel, about one's self-belief and one's understanding that that the common humanity that should bind us all is what we should mostly focus on, which is difficult because we're all different and we all feel unique, and we all are unique, but we also share a struggle to get through, particularly in the first instance, a winter of injustice and inequality that faces us all. So in conclusion, I'm dedicating this session, as you've heard before, to Professor Dr. Ataullah Siddiqui, who was a great lead to us at Markfield Institute. I'm also dedicating it indirectly to my colleagues and friends in the Shia community, the Shia Muslim groups at Al-Mahdi College in Birmingham and Islamic College in London. The richness of Islamic faith in Britain really is the envy of Europe. Europe wonders why we're so good at setting up these institutions which do work closely with universities. So perhaps if we could end on an upbeat note, there is plenty to celebrate, but we need to preserve it, notice that it's there, and treasure it. In higher education, which is where my research is mostly focused, there are a lot of students who are outraged by Prevent, whether they're Muslim or not, a lot of students who wish sincerely and fervently to be able to support Ruqiyya in her endeavors to create a more open picture of Islam on campus, Islam in the world, and the world for all of us, the benefits that will accrue to us when we understand that similarity is the key, not difference. So I think I'll close now and thank again my amazing team who are in the background this evening, invisible because we're doing everything online. I thank you very much, team, brilliant work. And thank you so very much, Yahya, Ruqiyya, Rachel, Samir. I think Zara's gone, but it was brilliant presentations. And Naz, Shah, in your absence, this is the interesting thing about working with parliamentarians, that they usually do have another call on their time. And this means that it's even more worthwhile trying hard to have conversations with them whenever possible. Talk to your MP, make friends with your local MP, and see if that brings you some benefit. It should do. This is a democracy, we hope. So thank you all very much, and I wish you a lovely rest of the evening. And enjoy the rest of the World Cup if you're minded that way. I try and keep up to date with it for my husband's sake. And Godspeed. Good night. Thank you.